Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the second reading of this very historic opportunity to contribute to a debate around our Constitution and the proposal that this bill will be putting to the Australian people. And I note the historical significance of us having a debate around changing our Constitution, because it happens very rarely. Obviously, there was a debate that didn't proceed to referendum back in 2012-2013 of the Gillard government. The last time there was a proposition to change the Constitution discussed in this chamber. The last time we passed a bill for a referendum, of course, was for the Republic referendum in 1999. Before that, you go back, on average, more than a decade between each time proposals come forward, and many speakers have noted that it is very difficult for a referendum to be successful, and it has been a rarity, given the number of proposals that have been put forward, for them to be successful. And I know other speakers have talked about the mechanism that we have, not only achieving the national vote but the majority of states as well. And this proposition, I come to an interesting point of view. I'll be supporting the bill because I do support this question being put to the Australian people and this proposition being resolved, much like the 1999 referendum resolved the question around constitutional monarchy for many decades into the future. I equally have already been very clear in public with the fact that I will have a vote like the 17.5 million other Australians for this referendum, and I will absolutely not be supporting the proposal to change our Constitution as outlined in this bill. But I'm very comfortable with the people of this country having their say, and I hope to be a part of the campaign to convince them that this is not a change that is in the best interests of our nation and the good government of this nation. South Australia was very central to the drafting of our Constitution, and Sir John Downer in particular was one of the pioneering early drafters of various proposals through the 1890s that culminated in the Australian Constitution, which was adopted in both through the United Kingdom Parliament and, of course, through decision, including Western Australia ultimately, and thankfully we love having Western Australia in the Commonwealth. And Deputy Speaker, I know that you're very proud as a Western Australian that the good people of Western Australia are in the Commonwealth and remain in the Commonwealth, as they so should, for a long time into the future. At Federation, something that's not very well understood is that the voting enfranchisement for the first Commonwealth elections was based on people that were on the electoral roll in the various colonies that became the states. And in my home state of South Australia, we had Indigenous enfranchisement in South Australia, and on the first Commonwealth, at the first Commonwealth elections in the state of South Australia, and only in the state of South Australia, Indigenous South Australians had a vote. And at one stage, of course, South Australia was potentially the only state that had, in the 1890s, at one stage, we were going to be the only state that enfranchised women to vote at that first Commonwealth election. And regrettably, it was the case that the South Australian electoral roll became the federal roll. If you're an Indigenous South Australian on the electoral roll at the time of Federation, you stayed on the electoral roll, but Indigenous Australians could not then join the Commonwealth election roll in the early decades of our Commonwealth, and that was shameful. And I'm very pleased that over the decades, in fact more than a century since, we have broken down so many elements of inequality around race, around gender, religion, age, all sorts of things that used to potentially hold back certain Australians in different ways within not just the formal structures of government but also the way in which our society operated in the past. We have spent so much time breaking those divisions down, and I feel that we've never been a more united and a more equitable nation than we are now in the year 2023. And there are no doubt more opportunities to continue to improve on the equity of this nation. But I have three serious concerns with the proposition that this bill will put to people to change our constitution. And the first is very much rooted in that sense of equity, and particularly equity of citizenship in our nation. I have great concern that what we're doing through this proposal is, of course, suggesting or creating a different treatment for certain Australians in our constitution to other Australians. And even though there is great virtue in elements of arguments that people may put as to why certain special treatment should be or is justified, that can always be the beginning of a very dangerous trend and an unforeseen trend, and one that has not gone the way that some early proponents thought it might when they stepped down this path throughout history. And I think equity of citizenship in this nation is vitally important. It was wrong when we had inequality of citizenship. It was wrong when Indigenous Australians weren't entitled to vote in elections. It was wrong when women weren't entitled to vote in elections. It's been wrong when Australians, for different reasons, have been discriminated against throughout our history. And so here in 2023, I stand very firmly against that kind of inequity being reintroduced in any way, shape or form, particularly into the constitution of our nation. Secondly, I'm very sceptical about the benefit of creating a new bureaucracy here in Canberra and its likely effectiveness in addressing real and serious issues of Indigenous disadvantage, which are important and should have our focus. And creating a new bureaucracy in Canberra, I'm not so convinced in all the various examples we could call upon as to when more government's been created, particularly centralised here in Canberra, as to whether or not that's ever achieved the kind of benefit that people might claim, some might claim, would be of benefit through this proposition. I'm desperately concerned, I think everyone in this House is desperately concerned about the serious challenges that need our attention for Indigenous Australians, but particularly in remote Indigenous communities where the issues are their most acute. I think it is regrettable that at the moment the only topic regarding Indigenous assistance, welfare and support from government is around whether or not this new bureaucracy should be created in our constitution, rather than the kinds of discussions we could have right now instead of on this topic about ways in which we could do better to provide assistance into the most significant challenges that are facing Indigenous communities. We know what they are. We have the Closing the Gap process and the annual report against those metrics. And some have had better progress than others, but in no way are we close to closing the gap. And we are spending an inordinate amount of time on text in our constitution and a bureaucracy in Canberra, and whatever the costs are around that, which I think is time that could be much better spent talking about serious practical solutions to the challenges in those communities. My third concern is very much around us not becoming, frankly, like the United States of America, a country I greatly admire. But one thing I think they get wrong in the United States is that their courts decide things that I think are in the purview of parliaments and the democratic process. And I don't want to see a situation where we change our constitution and create open lawfare over a whole range of questions, and we've got no control over where the jurisprudence may head and may land on a whole range of things that occur when you change dramatically the constitution of our nation. The constitution has supremacy, and the High Court has the ability to interpret that constitution with no ability for this chamber or this parliament to interfere or change with that interpretation whatsoever. And we've heard through evidence to the committee into this and the public debate, there are many former High Court justices with varied opinions on this, former eminent jurists, and people coming from both sides of the argument around advocacy for this change. None of them are saying that there is no risk as to what and how the powers of what we are creating might be interpreted by the High Court and what that could lead to around the way in which our government functions. Now, I love our Westminster system of government. I love the fact that the executive of government comes from the legislature and is accountable to the legislature. Yes, we have an independent judiciary, and they quite rightly adjudicate over questions of interpretation of law, and most importantly, in the case of the High Court, the Constitution, the governing document of our nation, which is why changing the Constitution is so significant, because in doing it you don't come back from the consequences of that. And the uncertainty around that and the potential that right now, if people don't like the current government and their local member of parliament is in that government, they can vote them out at the next election. They can come to see me as their local member, and we'll all have a great deal of advocacy from our constituents who are for and against this very issue that we're debating right now, and many other issues that will come into the court of public opinion and into the public domain and into this parliament. And we're accountable to those voters, to their views, and every 3 years, I think we could change that to 4 at some time, but every 3 years they get to choose whether they're happy with their local member of parliament and the government of their nation. And that accountability is to every Australian who gets a vote in selecting their representatives and the composition of this parliament. And we must cherish that and the fact that we are such a strong, vibrant democracy because of that. Now, I don't want to see a situation where we have that except. We have that except in a whole range of cases where the High Court's determined that because we've changed our Constitution in a certain way, that there are now elements of our democracy that are taken away from our democracy and are taken away from this parliament. And that is unequivocally the consequence of creating an additional power in the Constitution and creating another body within our governmental framework that has rights and powers that may well be determined in whatever so way by the High Court into the future. And when we find out the answer to all these questions, it will be when we've already changed our Constitution permanently into the future. We've got about 6 months to debate. This is my understanding from indications from the government once this bill is passed, that the referendum question will be put later in the year around October, November. We are going to have a spirited debate, and that's one of the great things about our democracy. I commend the contribution of my good friend, the member for Menzies, who made the most important point in the debates that I've listened to so far, without disrespecting excellent contributions from all members. And that is that we must have a civility and a respect in this debate, because everyone is contributing to it because they love their country, they care about our future, they have views about what will make this country even better into the future. And a debate about our Constitution couldn't be a more fundamental conversation for lawmakers to have, for civic leaders to have, for every Australian to have. And those conversations will happen over the next 6 months. At times there will be nasty contributions, and we should call out those nasty contributions. At times people will get personal, and we should not tolerate that. At times wild claims will be made that are not relevant to the debate, that are seeking to trick people into believing certain things might occur that might not. And that is possible to happen from both sides of the argument. There's no question about that. And I come at this with a view on what should happen, and I will call out people that seek the same outcome as me if they behave in that way. And I hope all members particularly have that same attitude, and I'm sure they will. I will support this bill through the parliament. I'm very comfortable with the people of my electorate having their say on this. I think it's very important. I think it is something that needs to be resolved by having a referendum. I will support the bill. I will campaign against changing our Constitution in that referendum campaign. I will vote against it, and I'll absolutely respect the result of that referendum when the people of this country have their final say. I commend the bill to the House.